Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kate Seeley, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second talk in our Oman Book Talk series. For this series, we're hosting historians, analysts, novelists every 2 months or so to give writers on the Middle East a platform to share their ideas and their books with wider audiences. And we also want to introduce our audiences to our Oman library at the Middle East Institute, which is in this lovely carriage house where we carry 20,000 books on the Middle East. It's apparently the second largest collection of Middle East books in Washington, D.C., outside of the Library of Congress. And it's open to the public 5 days a week from 10 to 4 for people to come, sit, research, check out books, and just learn more about the region. So please do check it out. If you're interested, come see me afterwards and we can get you a library card. And today we're delighted to be hosting Shadi Hamid for a conversation about his latest book, The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea, published this year by Oxford University Press. And in his book, Shadi tackles the question of how best to approach democracy promotion. He notes the U.S. seems to desire democracy in theory rather than in practice, especially when democracy leads to the rise of illiberal Islamist parties, as it did following the Arab Spring. And in light of this democratic dilemma, as he puts it, he lays out the argument for how the U.S. should better approach democracy promotion in the region. Shadi is a columnist and member of the editorial board at the Washington Post, where he focuses on culture, religion, and foreign policy. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is the author of several books, including Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. It was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize for Best Book on Foreign Affairs. Shadi is joined in conversation by Thomas Carruthers, who holds the Harvey V. Feinberg Chair for Democracy Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's a senior fellow there and co-director of Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. And Tom is a leading authority on international support for democracy, human rights, governance, the rule of law, and civil society. And moderating the discussion today is Gönül Tol, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and the founding director of MEI's Turkey program. She's the author of Erdogan's War, A Strong Man's Struggle at Home and in Syria. And she's hosting a major conference on Turkey this December 6th at the National Press Club. I hope you can join us. Just check it out at mei.edu. And she'll soon be launching a democracy podcast at MEI. So stay tuned for that. So thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it. Before we begin, I just want to note that we are taping this event, so it can be found online after the fact. Today's program will run for about an hour, perhaps a little bit longer if we have some interesting debate going on. And afterwards, Shadi will be signing his book back there at the table. It's selling for $20. And for those who want to linger and enjoy the reception, please stick around to discuss some of the ideas being presented here today. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Gönül. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am very happy to be moderating this discussion. Both Shadi and Tom are scholars that I follow very closely, and I admire their work. And I know we say this about every event that we host, but this one is truly timely because we live in an age when more and more people are questioning the virtues and vices of democracy. And I think Shadi's book forces you to do exactly that and more of that. The book makes you ask questions not just about democracy, but about the fundamental assumptions that we make about political community, about rights, about human rights, about the good life, and what role political community should and should not play in providing that good life. So it was an excellent read. There were moments when reading the book, when I wished Shadi was sitting right next to me, so he would answer every question that popped up in my mind. I think it was a really excellent, thought-provoking book. So if you haven't already, please pick it up. It's great. Shadi, before I pose my questions, why don't you take a few minutes to lay out the main argument of your book and explain to us the title, the problem with of democracy.
Yeah, well, great. First of all, thanks, Gonal. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Tom, for being a part of this. And thanks to MEI for hosting me. It's good to be back here. So the problem of democracy, to state it simply, is what do we do when democracy produces bad outcomes? And I would put bad in scare quotes because part of the problem is that we no longer agree on what constitutes a bad outcome or a good outcome. We live in increasingly diverse societies where there are ideological, religious, and ethnic divides. So it's going to be hard to come to a consensus around the good life. So, and then that's a kind of like a theoretical kind of broader question. Then there is the question of how it relates to US policy. And as Kate mentioned in her introduction, I'm quite critical of the US when it comes to its efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East. But even saying that there are efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East is maybe overstating matters. I would actually argue that the US has undermined democratization in the Middle East for many decades now. And that's part of why I suppose we're sitting here having this conversation, but I'll get into more of that later, the specific US policy angle. But in short, the US US politicians say they want democracy in theory, but they're not very comfortable with the outcomes of democracy in practice. So that is the democratic dilemma that we're going to be hopefully unpacking today. I propose a way out of this dilemma. It won't be to everyone's liking, but I think it is a path that is worth considering. And I term this democratic minimalism. And as the term suggests, I want to readjust our expectations around democracy. Instead of seeing democracy as this all-encompassing good thing that always produces good outcomes, I want to be a little bit more realistic about it, because the fact of the matter is that good things don't necessarily go together. And I think it's a product of a particularly American way of thinking, that we think if democracy is good, then naturally it has to produce good outcomes. But what we're finding increasingly, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world, including right here at home, is that democracy doesn't necessarily produce good outcomes. And when I say good outcomes, I'm referring to things like, could be economic growth, political consensus, decreasing polarization. And then there's the big one that we assume that democracy leads to liberalism. And part of what I do in the book, and I know Gonal will talk more about this, is I try to do a sort of conscious uncoupling between democracy and liberalism. I think we too often conflate these terms. There is overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. And I think it's worth disentangling those two terms that we use a lot in the conversation around these issues. You know, in the book, I focus on the Middle East. I use cases in the Middle East to illustrate this broader dilemma. And the dilemma has been around for a while, unfortunately. We can probably go back quite a bit, but I start focusing on Algeria in 1991. An Islamist party is on the verge of coming to power. And then the Algerian military, staunchly secular, steps in, cancels elections, and then Algeria goes through a civil war for the remainder of the decade. And we're sort of back to where I think scholars were in the mid-90s or early 90s, where we still have this debate about, oh, what happens when Islamist parties come to power? And I've been involved in, I'm not super old, I guess I'm relatively young, all things considered, but I've been engaged on this debate since, I guess, 2004, 2005, during the Bush administration's freedom agenda. And it is a little bit sad that we still have to kind of discuss this at a very basic level. And that leads me to just mention a couple things about part 2 of the book, which is where I lay out my ideal sort of hopes of what a democracy promotion policy could look like in the Middle East. We talk a lot about how democracy is good and that the US should do a better job of promoting it in the Middle East. But my feeling is that oftentimes it stays at the level of generality. So what I try to do in a lot of detail is unpack, if you wanted the most fully fledged case for democracy promotion, what would the US actually have to do? And what would that mean for specific countries? What would that mean for fundamentally reorienting our policy in the Middle East? And that's precisely what I advocate for. I'm no longer interested in tinkering around the margins and having small policy fixes here and there. I do, and I'll just say it straight up, I believe that US policy in the Middle East is rotten to its core, and it has been for decades. And we have to really go to the foundations of US policy. And as Americans, rethink those foundations and try to propose something in some ways completely different. And that's what I try my best to do in the book. And hopefully for those of you who read, you can be the judge of whether that vision is sufficiently compelling or not. And just the last thing I'll say is I used to be at Brookings for a long time, and part of why I sort of knew that I would have to move on at some point is because I myself was losing interest in the Middle East. I felt like I had said a lot of what I wanted to say over the years about Islamist parties, the Muslim Brotherhood, democracy promotion. And I suppose my hope was, at least in part, to focus less on the Middle East. Like at some point, you just got to say, hey, we do the best we can. And the US and various American administrations have been very resistant to change. We've been making the same case over and over. And I think, like a lot of other people, I felt like I had hit a wall and that things had become hopeless. And I reserve a lot of criticism for the Obama administration. We'll get to that. And it's interesting that I'm sort of back to working a lot on the Middle East in light of recent events. And I remember the day before October 7th happened, I was talking to a journalist friend at a party here in DC, and she was asking me, why have you shifted to the Washington Post? What will you be focusing on there, and so forth? And I said that no one really cares about the Middle East anymore. That's what I said the night before October 7th. And then we wake up to a brand new world, and a very tragic one. And I think we're coming back to a lot of these foundational questions. So just in terms of the background of how I'm thinking about this, as someone who is sort of personally invested in these topics and quite frustrated, I have been trying to, work through and channel my frustration for many years now. And I guess it's time to, re-engage at least to some extent on Middle East issues. So.
Well, thank you so much, Shadi. I think I share your frustration about US policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, and I think you did an excellent job at summarizing that, and I agree with many of your policy recommendations there as well. My problem with the book is that notion of separating democracy and liberalism. Not that it's not, that democracy and liberalism can diverge. That's not a novel point. Pre-democracies were not liberal, and historically there have been societies, liberal societies, that were not governed democratically. So I think political scientists would largely agree on that point. Democracy is about the question of who rules, and it requires that the people should rule, either directly or indirectly through free and fair elections. Liberalism, on the other hand, it doesn't really deal with that question of who rules. It's about limiting the power of the rulers once they are in power. So liberalism is about actually protecting the rights of the individual, both against rulers and could be vis-a-vis other groups and other individuals. So this is, and obviously liberalism requires the rule of law, right? So you need individual rights and you need the rule of law. And that's the classical definition of liberalism. So when we talk about liberal democracy, we're actually talking about a system in which all adults have the right to choose their representatives through free and fair elections. So that's the democracy aspect of the equation. The liberal part comes in where you have, again, the rule of law, and you have certain civic liberties that is protected by the rule of law. So what is confusing about your conceptualization and about your argument, Shadi, for me is you are saying that let's drop the liberal aspect and prioritize democracy. And based on this classical interpretation of liberalism that I just provided, I would understand from your argument that you are suggesting a system where there is no rule of law and there are no individual rights. But actually, you're not doing that. So you are not saying exactly that. In your democratic minimalism, you are actually, that definition includes the rule of law and individual rights. But those individual rights are a very peculiar subset of individual rights, because you are actually prioritizing the political rights, right to political representation, and that requires voting, freedom of speech, and things like that. But there are individuals have other rights too, right? Right to religious freedom, right to the freedom from torture, or cultural rights. So what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that let's not focus on that subset of rights, but focus on the political individual rights. So you're not actually dropping all the things classical liberalism is about, rule of law and individual rights. You're just not calling it liberalism. Instead, you're calling it democratic minimalism. So your definition of, this is the problem I have. So your definition of liberalism reminds me of the populist definition of liberalism, which is pushed by people like Trump and Viktor Orban, who define liberalism as support for immigration, as support for gay rights and multiculturalism, things like that. This is indeed the meaning the word liberalism has taken on, but it's a very new thing. Historically, this hasn't been the case. I mean, until the last half century, many liberal democracies were fairly strict in terms of family law and not allowing immigration. So that's the problem I have. Can you please clarify what you mean?
No, it's a great question. And this is a criticism that's leveled at me a lot, and understandably so. I guess it's, somewhat, it is one of the more controversial arguments in the book. So, the overarching premise is that when small d democracy and small l liberalism are in tension, I think we should prioritize small d democracy. Now, the question is, when are they in tension? And similar to what you said, when I talk about democracy, I'm talking about procedural mechanisms for conflict management. And that's often primarily done through rotation of power, through regular elections. And these elections, to be clear, have to be reasonably free and fair and competitive. And this is where I make a distinction between political liberalism and cultural liberalism. I think we need to preserve and fight for and prioritize political liberalism. I'm less enthusiastic about the cultural, social, and religious basket, because the former is about the means and the latter is about the ends. I think that we as American observers should be somewhat agnostic about the ends of politics in countries that are not our own. So presumably, Egyptians, Pakistanis, Hungarians, whatever, Turks, will all differ on what values they want to prioritize and how they understand the good life. So my real concern is I don't want America to be engaged in debates around the good life in other countries. I don't think that's our role. And I think that we as Americans can't be neutral on that, because we tend to have our own commitments in that regard. So another way of thinking about how we separate between these two kinds of liberalism, political and cultural, I think, so the right to gather in a public square and protest your government, that would fall under political liberalism. That is absolutely essential because the opposition won't have a reasonable chance of winning in an election unless parties can actually communicate their preferences to voters. They need to be able to go out and protest. You need to be able to criticize your government. All these, you need to have some access to the media because if people don't know what your platform is, it'll be hard for them to vote for you, so on and so forth. So those things are important and actually essential for having free, competitive elections. If you look at the cultural liberalism or illiberalism, so let's imagine if an Islamist party comes to power through free elections. They might, if they have a majority in parliament, they may try to legislate restrictions on alcohol consumption, restrictions to the right to have an abortion, restrictions on insulting prophets and divine texts, so on and so forth. I don't love those things personally, but because those things are about the ends of politics, they're about value commitments, I don't think that we as Americans should be very involved in condemning an elected government for making particular choices on those cultural and social questions. So that's how I generally describe, I try to unpack these different concepts. And the ones that are sometimes controversial, because when we're talking about liberalism, and sometimes the shorthand I use is what we associate with the Bill of Rights is a a pretty good representation of what liberalism is, at least to some extent. And this is where questions around minority rights and women's rights also become important. Unfortunately, again, not my preference, but in religiously conservative societies, if there are free and fair elections, groups and parties that aren't amazing on gender equality will likely do well, to put it mildly. So we have a dilemma there. So yes, and I think that if you talk to US policymakers, they'll often bring up this dilemma because any individual policymaker will be torn, because if you're someone who has a commitment to minority rights and women's rights, you want to see that come out and you think democracy will lead to that, but unfortunately oftentimes it doesn't. And so I want to find a way out of that dilemma.
But actually, and Tom, I'll ask you to weigh in on this, but you said that political rights, right to vote is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Is that from a moral point of view or from a pragmatic point of view? Because let's say you said that, minority rights, women's rights, we think that democracy is going to bring about those things. But I think securing those rights are absolutely essential for the functioning of democracy. So when you talk about, again, what bothers me is the hierarchy that you're placing on political rights, because let's say I'm a Muslim woman living in Nigeria or in Malaysia, right? I have the right to vote, so I have the right to change the government peacefully, but I have to undergo female genital mutilation because in the name of religion, in the name of society, because that's what the society wants, because that's part of the collective rights. So where is my most basic right? I have the political right to vote, but the state, society, political authority is actually undermining my most basic right to freedom from torture. And I want to go to you, Tom, just to weigh in on that. I mean, not the female circumcision part, but more generally on what Shadi is trying to do, decoupling those two notions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. First, let me just say, Shadi, that a lot of discussion about democracy here in Washington and generally is quite superficial. And too many discussions of democracy do make a lot of assumptions, such as you mentioned, all good things going together and so forth. And this book really makes you think hard. This book makes you think hard about what democracy is, what it means to us, how it should be pursued, and so forth. And secondly, a lot of discussions of how the United States should or shouldn't support democracy are very cautious and very iterative. You go deep, in this book, and you sort of throw a Hail Mary in the book about, we'll get to, about what you think the US should do. And I appreciate that. Not enough discussions, go deep. So I just want to say that. On this question of illiberalism, I think part of the reason I'm here is I'm not a Middle East specialist. I'm kind of a generalist on democracy issues. And I want to try to provide some perspectives that draw upon examples from other parts of the world as well. I think this question of separating political illiberalism and sociocultural illiberalism is an interesting one, and it's worth the intellectual exercise and potentially the practical one of doing so. But I want to pose for you a little bit, to go into a little further by offering the following observation, that the two halves of illiberalism, as we see them in so many different countries in the world, are tending to bleed into each other. So you have, for example, political illiberals who end up drawing upon sociocultural illiberalism to feed the fire of political illiberalism. Think of Vladimir Putin. He didn't start as a Russian Orthodox conservative. He was an FSB agent. He was a political illiberal who, once in power, was looking for sources of cultural support, in a sense, for his vision of Russian nationalism. And he began borrowing upon a sociocultural illiberal agenda to fortify his political illiberalism. Viktor Orban has done that similarly. He started as a political illiberal after he was reelected in 2010, began undermining the rule of law, undermining the voting system in different ways. And then in 2015, glommed onto the immigration issue as fuel for the fire. Then you have the other direction. You have illiberals who start as sociocultural illiberals, but then bleed into political illiberalism. Think of Modi in India. Sociocultural illiberalism with respect to the status of Muslims in India and with Hindu nationalism. But then once in power, the flames of illiberalism start to lick over and burn up the institutions of liberal democracy, because in order to pursue his sociocultural liberal agenda, he needs to undermine the rule of law in different ways and other things that he's done that are quite politically illiberal. Or think of the Polish Law and Justice Party, which came to power as a sociocultural illiberal force against abortion, against the progressive agenda in Poland, but then to carry out that agenda needed to undermine the institutions of political liberalism, particularly the judiciary. So the problem with illiberalism is it doesn't stay in the boundary very well. And then you have people like Donald Trump, who are kind of a salad bar of illiberalism. You can quote me on that, who draws upon both sociocultural and political at the same time in a very complicated way. So it made me think, and I was curious your thoughts on this. Where have we seen examples outside of the context of Islamist parties in Muslim majority countries of illiberal, sociocultural illiberals in power in a democracy who do not become political illiberals? So I thought about that. One example might be Meloni in Italy. She's a sociocultural illiberal in certain ways within the European context, particularly on immigration, somewhat on LGBTQ rights. She has so far not crossed the line into political illiberalism. It's a pretty mild sociocultural illiberalism. A Muslim majority country example might be Indonesia, where I know it's of interest to you, and you mentioned it in the book. But the point is, one has to think hard to find illiberals who don't cross the boundary. And so you're premising your argument on, trust me, I think sociocultural liberalism can stand as a force without burning down the firewall of political liberalism. But the experience in most parts of the world is the firewall gets burned down from one direction or the other.
Yeah, no, it's a great set of questions. So I'd say a couple things. I mean, first, just as a point of clarification, I'm not calling for unlimited majority desires being reflected. This is not full-on tyranny of the majority that I'm advocating here, because I presume that in any society, there's still going to be a constitutional framework. It's very rare to not to have some at least legal or constitutional framework for participating in politics. So there will be limitations based on whatever the constitution is in a given country. So something like female genital mutilation would presumably be prohibited because it would be just a fundamental violation, and that would be somewhere in a relevant constitution. I guess I would say, but I will admit that I am more permissive about majorities. I'm willing to accept more, and that can be more, that can also mean more problematic things. But in the end, I think that, so even if you take the US, you could kind of undo rights for minorities if you had a large enough majority. So there's always going to be a way for the majority to get its way if the majority is large enough. If you have 75% of both states and 2/3 of both houses of Congress, you can alter the Bill of Rights, and you can presumably pass crazy things that, like, ban, for example, a Muslim from holding a cabinet position. So there's always going to be a threshold. The question is where you draw that line. Now, I think that I'm very much biased towards the Middle East. And in the Middle East, we just have a reality that if you hold democratic elections, social and culturally religious parties will do well, as I mentioned earlier. I don't really see a way to get around that. So I think if we're talking about the Middle East specifically, we simply don't have a choice. If we're serious about democracy in these countries, we have to accept that cultural illiberalism will come out through the democratic process and be reflected in certain kinds of legislation if there's a large enough parliamentary majority. I don't know how you change that or get around it. So part of my argument is simply pragmatic. I don't know what the alternative is. In the Middle East too, I should say, democratic declines or the overthrowing of democracy altogether, primarily the people who do that, unfortunately, are so-called liberals and secularists. So if we actually look at the record, I'm totally comfortable saying that the people with the worst record by far are so-called liberals. And, you know, knowing a lot of them and engaging with them in countries like Egypt, there is no group in my life and experience that is more anti-democratic than Egyptian liberals. They don't believe in democracy because they see that democracy will lead to the masses getting their way. And they look down on the religiosity or piety of the masses. And there's actually an interesting study that I cite in the book from Tariq Masoud at Harvard, where he actually goes through, I think it's 71 democratic declines in Muslim majority countries since 1974. And out of those 71, he finds that Islamist parties are only implicated in 3 of them.
Is Turkey one of them? I checked that reference, but I couldn't.
I don't think he quite got.
No,
I'm actually not sure.
2020, so it is there.
Yeah, but maybe, but people, and we'll get to Turkey. Like, how does Turkey get classified? But yes, we can add Turkey. So it would be, and so there are a handful of cases, but the preponderance of negative cases come from so-called secular parties. So if that's what you're dealing with, then we have to try an alternative. So people sometimes will ask me, Shadi, can you guarantee that if Islamist parties come to power, things will be fine? I can't make that guarantee. There is a risk. And this is why I actually am somewhat understanding of Egyptian friends and Turkish friends who say, Shadi, it's nice for you to say all this, but we're the ones who have to live with the consequences of elections. You don't. You're an American observer. And most of my family in Egypt, so I'm born and raised here, but of Egyptian origin, almost all of my family in Egypt was pro-military coup against the elected government of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there is anti-democratic as you can get. I mean, I love some of them. I mean, some of them are good people, but this is a blind spot that a lot of people have. And similarly, Turks will understandably tell me, listen, Shadi, what about Erdogan? That didn't work out in a very ideal way. I don't think it's an example of one person, one vote, one time. Maybe it's an example of one person, one vote, 6 times, because it took the AK Party several elections to become more authoritarian. So, but you're the expert on that, so I'll defer to you. But that's maybe, so I guess I would say that there is a risk. And there is this kind of spillover sometimes, as you mentioned, in some of these cases between political and cultural illiberalism. But in the specific cases of the Middle East, I think that that's still our best bet, because if we had it, if we had a third option of pure, perfect liberal democracy, I would say great. But we're kind of where we are, which is we have so-called ostensibly secular autocrats on one hand, and then fears that democracy will lead. And it's not just Islamist parties. It could also be nationalist parties, or even secular parties that end up playing the Islamist card, as happens in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, we have quite a bit of cases where secular governments, secular parties in power are the ones who implement Sharia ordinances on the local level. And some of them are kind of intense. So, and you might ask, why are secular parties in Indonesia doing that? Because on the local level, in quite religiously conservative areas, they got to meet the median voter where the median voter is. And if the median voter is extremely religiously conservative in some of these regions of Indonesia, they're going to play the game. So there's an almost kind of out Islamization that secular parties engage in.
For sure, and this, this happens with whenever you deal with a regional specialist, always look at their country of origin and think about how it shapes their views. Egypt is a very telling example of the things you talk about. But in some ways, how typical is Egypt within the region? As you was using the word liberals to describe some people in Egypt, I was thinking of the Gulf, thinking I would describe the Saudi elite as a group of liberals.
Yeah.
Or actually most Gulf elites really as liberals. And so what I'm wondering is the dynamic that you feel is fundamental in the Middle East, as you describe it, is that we're stuck with autocracies because if the bell jar of autocracy were lifted, Islamist forces would surge, win elections, and so forth. Is that really the dynamic in, say, Jordan? Is that the dynamic? Was that what happened in Libya when things fell apart? Is that what would happen in the Gulf? It's a very Egyptian problem. It was kind of a Tunisian problem, but then it got somewhat alleviated in the 2010s. Still, it fell apart. But so I wonder how much, I felt a little bit reading your book that I was reading about sort of Egypt in 2010 or 2009, but I wondered how much it applied to the whole region now. Is there really what's keeping democracy in the Middle East the fear of Islamists in most countries, or is it the fact you have entrenched power elites who simply don't want to give up power and may use various excuses for not wanting to do so? But the dynamic isn't really surging Islamist forces that are being kept under versus secular elites who are keeping them out. I don't think of Algeria like that, and it was in 1988, 91, not today. So does this really apply?
So I do think it applies, Algeria in the 1990s. I do think it applies to Tunisia until the present day. And it's a bigger conversation, but one of the reasons that, for example, the secular and Islamist opposition haven't been able to unite, because there was a slow motion coup that started, as many of you might know, in 2021, and now Tunisia is no longer a democracy, it's an authoritarian regime. And fears around Ennahda, because right before the coup happened, Ennahda, the Islamist party there, had taken on the position of Speaker of Parliament. Rashid Nushi took that position, the leader of the party. So there were still this undercurrent of fears and concerns that Islamists were dominating the parliamentary process. And when you talk to secular opposition activists to this day, and like, why aren't you doing more with Ennahda? Why can't you guys kind of figure things out and form a united front against the regime that led the coup, the regime of Kais Saied? It's like, well, do we necessarily want to go back to a situation where Ennahda had control of the parliament? We didn't like that either. So a lot of the disillusion we see in Tunisia, I think, is tied to a particular.
But did they not like it because Ennahda was so culturally liberal or politically liberal, or because they felt that the country was badly governed before?
Well, I think there's overlap between those two things. But I think there is definitely a sense that, it's Tunisian Islamists, as mild as they were and as like gentle and fluffy as they might have been on some of these issues, that they were hiding their true selves. So this discourse, this kind of idea that Islamists engage in double discourse, was still very much part of the Tunisian debate.
But if Tunisia had had a 7% growth rate in the 2010s, I guess they'd still be in power.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that, so you did have those kinds of growth rates with Islamists in Turkey. And I think you still see, understandably in this case. So I think you're right that economic growth can alleviate some of these concerns, and you'd have more likelihood. And with Morsi too, in 2012 and 2013, if the economy wasn't doing as bad, then perhaps less people would have been open to a military coup. So there's a kind of constant undercurrent of anti-Islamist sentiment. And it's worth noting that it's very hard for Islamists themselves to reassure people, because if they actually try to be more moderate, people then cite that as evidence that they're lying about who they really are. But if they're open about who they really are, and they're like, yeah, we want to promote various aspects of Islamic law and restrict this and that, then people will say, look, well, we know who they are. They are quite Islamist and conservative, and we can't have that because that will change the identity of the state, the kind of cultural milieu. So it's sort of this weird situation. I think Tunisia really captures this well, because Ennahda did almost everything you can possibly imagine to be like culturally acceptable. They completely diluted the Islamist content of their agenda and platform, to the extent that there was barely any Islamist content in some of their later platforms. But then there was still always this, well, Ghannouchi, he's just waiting for the right moment. And it's very hard to actually dissuade people of that. And I tried in the case of Egypt. And I should say, Tom, you're exactly right. Some of my views are colored disproportionately by Egypt. There's no doubt about that.
It's okay, it's the center of civilization.
Yeah, exactly. But I think Jordan fits into this to some extent. And we could maybe talk about this in a moment. But there's another part of the fear of Islamist parties. It's not just about culture, and it's also about their regional or their kind of foreign policy or their regional orientation. This is more relevant for American observers and American policymakers. So we're not just concerned about groups like the Muslim Brotherhood because we don't share their values and they're too conservative or radical or whatever it might be. It's that these groups are anti-American and anti-Israel, and they oppose the US-led regional order. So I think that is quite important for US policymakers if we're kind of talking about them as a group of people. And we can, to the extent that it's relevant, we can talk about that.
To that very point, I mean, Turkey is a textbook case where anti-Islamist fear and fear of minority rights have been the main drivers behind Turkey's illiberal democracy. Now it's not an illiberal democracy anymore; it's outright autocracy. But for many years, those were the twin fears of ethnic Kurdish separatism and fear of Islamists. And it wasn't just, as you said, Shadi, it wasn't just people who were not just fearful of an Islamist coming to power in Turkey and imposing his own cultural conservative views on society, but it was also from the secularist militarist point of view. They were also very fearful of what Erdogan might do to Turkey's pro-Western foreign policy. And that's why in my book, I often talk about how brilliantly Erdogan used foreign policy to convince liberals like me that he was not an Islamist anymore. So I would like to pose this, I guess, timeless question, which is, how do democracies emerge? I was born in Turkey long before Erdogan came to power. And as someone who was born in an illiberal democracy and someone who voted for an Islamist-rooted politician like Erdogan, in the hopes that he would make Turkish democracy better, instead, he took an illiberal democracy and turned it into autocracy. So I think about this question a lot. How do democracies emerge? And also the question of sequencing, right? I mean, indeed, countries in the first wave of democratization started in the 19th century. The sequencing was those countries, they had become modern states before they introduced universal suffrage. In the third wave of democratization that started in the 1970s, it was the other way around. They introduced, they opened up the political system before they became modern states with like rule of law, civil society, and things like that. So part of me thinks, again, being from Turkey, you know, I'm very concerned by illiberalism, right? And conflict. So maybe in countries like Turkey, where there's this deep polarization and different segments of the country have this existential anxiety vis-a-vis the other. You have Islamists, you have secularists, you have Kurds, you have Turks. So in societies like Turkey, part of me thinks maybe the founding elite should have put off democracy or gradually introduce key components of political competition until the rule of law and a well-functioning state were in place. But then the other part of me thinks, well, what if those founding elite? What if that moment never comes? And I think that's one of the points that you raise. So how do you tackle that question, the sequencing?
Yeah, and I think, Tom, I'd be curious what you have to say on this, because you've written a lot on the sequencing paradigm in the transitions literature. I mean, from my perspective, I think Jordan's an interesting case here because the Jordanian monarchy has been promising, it's basically made a version of this argument that we have to liberalize Jordanian society, and we, the king and the queen, are going to put forward this more progressive vision. And then at some later point, maybe Jordanians will be ready for fully fledged democracy. But we've been hearing that for a very long time now. And it's a kind of endless liberalization that doesn't lead to democracy. It's actually meant to prevent democratization. And politicians in the Arab world are very smart about how they weaponize liberalization, because they say to Western audiences and Western policymakers, the King of Jordan is very good at this, but also the Moroccan king. They say, look at us. We're the best thing you got. Bear with us. And I guess my fundamental objection to a certain kind of sequencing is the basic argument is that you have to have a democratic culture before you actually have democracy. But then the question is, how do you develop a democratic culture in the absence of democracy? So you end up in this sort of circular loop that's very hard to resolve. I would argue that it's very hard to develop a democratic culture under authoritarian rule, because these are regimes that basically they try to break the spirit of their own people. They're about cutting their own people down to size. So any sign of dissent or democratic spirit that they see, secular, Islamist, socialist, or whatever, they're going to find ways to nip that at the bud. And that is very much the playbook of Arab dictators. So UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, you might say, well, can't they just let a little bit of dissent? Do they have to like stamp out everything? But there is a kind of smartness to this. They know, or they fear, and they might have good reason to fear this, that if you allow mild dissent, there is a risk that it becomes more than mild. So I'm very skeptical that you can have a sequencing approach in the Middle East because of the particular nature of some of these regimes. But I think the broader point on existential divides is a really good one that you bring up. In any political setting where you have existential divides, in other words, if the divides are not about policy, they are about who we are. They're about what it means to be Turkish, Egyptian, the role of religion in public life. These are the foundation, what it means to be a state. What is the nation state? These are the fundamental questions. And I think that when you have those types of questions, you have to find ways to lower the temperature. And this is where we could have a very different conversation around electoral design or institutional design. How do you distribute power away from the center to make it harder for someone like Erdogan to consolidate power? And I think with Erdogan, there's a very interesting question of, is he autocratic because of his Islamism, or because he's just a normal politician who craves power. And we know that non-Islamist politicians in the past in Turkey also became quite authoritarian. So there's an interesting question about what's fundamentally motivating. Like, can we really blame Erdogan's authoritarianism on his Islamism? I think we have to be careful about that.
Great question. So in the book, I make the argument that it's not his Islamism that's brought the country where it is right now. He's basically a populist who picks and chooses different ideology. He's now a nationalist, for example, from an ideological point of view. Those two ideologies, Islamism and nationalism, clash. So, Tom, we have to open the discussion, questions from the audience. But so, can you weigh in on what Shadi said and say a few things?
I want to
about
give the audience a chance. So I'll be very brief. We could have a pretty long session on where democracies come from. I would just say that the autocratic regimes rarely build the liberal rule of law. They mostly undermine it. You know, in the 19th century, Western democracies did not emerge because benevolent autocrats kind of gradually liberalized and made the rule of law. There were things like the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, explosions of popular unrest that demanded power to the citizens. It wasn't that these benevolent autocrats just gradually created a great liberal rule of law. It's kind of a myth about how Western democracies emerged, that it was first a benevolent state and then sort of opened the doors to suffrage. Citizens demanded it. These days in the world, citizens want autonomy and they want a voice and so forth, and just saying, wait another 80 years just doesn't work anymore. Try it. You know, they'll be out on the streets. And so, you know, they tried in 2010, 2011 in parts of the Arab world. They've tried in many other places. And so that idea that sequencing is a very condescending and essentially irrelevant idea if you think about how politics really works. It isn't just little faucets that you turn this way and that's. It's explosive. It's the quest for dignity. And so let's get real, you know, in this sequencing debate.
But Turkish case is interesting in that regard because we had someone, a modernizer like Atatürk, for instance, who was willing to give up power. But again, I think sequencing, when
the Turkish secular elite had 80 or 90 years to introduce a bit of democracy or a bit of real rule of law. They didn't do it. It was an autocratic secular elite that was enjoying the autocracy that it had.
No, that's why, I mean, when I think about it, when the Turkish Republic was established in 1920s, if Turkey was the new state, was actually a modern state, things would have gone to a different direction. But so fascinating conversation. So please raise your hands if you have questions. Wait for the mic. Sorry. Oh yes, please tell us who you are and then ask your questions. There's gentleman there and then.
Hi there. I'm John Hydrisco. I'm just around. I'm not really anyone in particular. But I know your work best from Wisdom of Crowds. I'm not too much of an expert in the Middle East at all. I really don't know that much. But my question is, how much of the thesis of this book, because I kind of have a suspicion, did you reach from thinking about, writing about, talking about American domestic politics? Because I think in a lot of ways, I don't want to totally derail this, but your thesis in this book seems to kind of rhyme with what I've heard you say in recent years about American troubles with liberalism and democracy. So I was kind of wondering, like, what percentage of this book would you say was motivated by observations about the US?
Yeah.
Shadi,
sure.
Can we take another?
Sure, of course,
Let's take one more question, gentleman here, and then.
Larry Garber, now an independent consultant. You didn't speak about the other half of the book, I take it, which is what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy. So I'll give you the chance to do that with the question of that has troubled me, and it goes a bit to Tom's last point, which is, you know, that it's hard to project democracy onto another society, you know, from outside as it is from inside. So how does a government like the United States respond to indigenous developments? And I take the case of Tunisia. I take other cases where it wasn't the United States imposing something on the society. It was the society was responding to internal developments. And then the question became, and I mean, I was in the Obama administration at the time, what do we do in response to what we see happening on the streets of Tunisia or on the streets of some of the other countries that were part of the Arab Spring. We're not naive. We don't assume that, democracy is immediately going to result from our inputs, but we also don't want to, just stand aside and, say we're not going to support those democratic activists that are out there on the streets putting their lives on the line.
Great questions. So for the uninitiated, Wisdom of Crowds is the podcast I co-host, and you can check it out on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So, but we do talk more about American politics and that. So it's interesting that you were able to draw that connection. I would say that developments here at home were sort of the mood music for the book, even if I wasn't as explicit about that. But, for those who have seen, what I've written about Trump and illiberalism here in America, I was very much opposed to what I thought my own side was doing, Democrats, in other words, after Trump won, which I felt was a kind of delegitimization campaign. I felt that if Trump won fair and square, according to the rules that we had agreed to, the Electoral College, that we had to kind of live with that for 4 years and then try our best to beat him next time around. And I feel like many of my compatriots on the left side of the spectrum helped create a kind of cycle of radicalization by demonizing and delegitimizing Trump every step of the way, even before he took office, before there was any real evidence. And that, I think, created a very sour taste among conservatives, and then they decided to basically get their revenge, which reminds me sort of how I heard members of the AK party in Turkey, Erdogan's party, talk about secularists. I would say, hey guys, this is when I used to do more work on Turkey back in the day, and I would interview senior AK party leaders, and I asked them, like, guys, this isn't super democratic. What would you say to these objections? And some of them said to me in a very straight up way, Shadi, we won the election and we want revenge. We had to live under secular rule where even our daughters or wives couldn't even wear the headscarf in certain public and state institutions. We were suppressed for such a long time. It's our turn. And I think, unfortunately, everyone is sort of to blame for this kind of dynamic. And we all could play a role in trying to counteract that dynamic. But I think we'll have a very interesting test of the question you bring up in 2024. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have a lot of these debates as it relates to American politics. I'm just exhausted thinking about it. But I do think that Trump has a better than 50-50 chance of winning. So I just think we got to steel ourselves for this. Like, how do we feel about Trump winning a second time around? On the second question, just this is, I suppose, all the more reason to buy the book or borrow it from your local library, because it's hard to sort of sum up the second part of the book. But if you want, like, what I consider to be like a manual for what future US policymakers can and should do in the Middle East, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm like, my book is going to change things, but I do hope that some folks with policy influence read those parts of the book, and maybe, who knows, in 10 or 15 years, we might have a situation where someone gets to a very senior position on Middle East policy, and like one of those arguments will maybe linger in their memory, God willing. I mean, whatever, but we'll see. But I would say that I'm very much a believer that a lot of our leverage as America is unused, or we underestimate it. And I would always get in these debates with Obama administration officials where they would say, Shadi, you overestimate our leverage. I would say, I think you underestimate our leverage, and it's hard to sort of resolve it. I do think that the coup in Egypt in 2013 is a very important case, because, as I argue in the book, I do believe that President Obama gave what amounted to a green light to Sisi for the military coup to proceed. And I have original interviews where I reveal some new details about what happened on those critical days in the lead up to July 3rd, 2013, and in the days after, including in the Situation Room. I was able to get some very interesting interviews from folks who were with Obama in the room at some of these key moments, and some of it is shocking. And I'll just mention one quote. This was on the record from former ambassador to Egypt, Ann Patterson, who maybe some of you know. So I asked her about this question of leverage. And she said, and what, why couldn't you do more to prevent the coup from happening in Egypt? Why not? And she said, quote unquote, the fact is we probably did have leverage, but we were never going to use maximum leverage to prevent a coup. So I asked her, well, why not? Why wouldn't you use maximum leverage to prevent a coup? And she replied, at that point, there were a lot of people who weren't sorry to see Morsi go. And there's a lot of stuff like that. So it's a longer conversation, but the short version is that we have ways to use leverage, including through military assistance. I'm very much a proponent of, in the cases of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, to go to the max. And what that means is to threaten a full suspension of military assistance, including maintenance and spare parts. We could ground the Saudi military in the matter of weeks if we withheld certain crucial support. And we're the superpower here. We're the senior partner in these relationships, but we act as if they can push us around. This happens with Israel as well. We are the senior partner. We are the superpower. Let's act like it. And I just think that we get pushed around by these governments quite a bit. They need us more than we need them.
All right, a few more questions. So this and gentleman over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Radwan Masmoudi with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. As you know, Shadi, I loved your book. I loved reading your book when it came out. I was in Tunisia most of the last 10 years, trying to help build democracy in Tunisia. And I can tell you that one of the things that derailed democracy in Tunisia is the West insisting very quickly on gay rights. In 2015 and 2016, the European Union was funding with $10 million organizations, not only in Tunisia, but in the region, on gay rights.
Sorry, who was funding it?
The EU,
Yeah,
the European Union. MEPI also funded many organizations to promote gay rights as soon as 2015 in Tunisia. And I was having a lot of meetings with US officials and EU officials in Tunis, and I was begging them, give us some time. We are a new democracy. We haven't even had 1 or 2 years of democratic rule. You took 200 years in the US of democratic rule before you started talking about gay rights, because I was here since 1981, and there was no talk of gay rights between 1981 all the way to 1995 or something like that. Give us some time. And believe me, this is something that really turned many Tunisians against democracy, is these cultural rights. Pornography was banned under Ben Ali, but all of a sudden it had to become permissible under the democratic rule. Gay rights also, kissing in the streets, not fasting in Ramadan, all these small things were banned under Ben Ali. But under the democratic rule, we had to allow them and we had to accept them. And many Tunisians, especially the religious leaders, turned against democracy and said, look, if this is what democracy is, we're not interested in. So I really agree with the main recommendation of your book, which is to separate the political rights from cultural rights. We can emphasize political rights now, but cultural rights will take decades, and they will require discussions and negotiations and so on.
Hi, I'm Stephen Stern, and I work with and represent in the US the Ali Abu Awad Leadership Project and his social change and nonviolent anti-occupation movement in Palestine, Tahrir. Speaking of existential divides about who we are and what you're saying in terms of political democracy, democratic liberalism, it's a huge stretch. I mean, the earth is salted, the chasms are opened. There's so many divides going on. But at some point, what will be the role in Palestinian society and Israeli society of coming elections?
Okay.
You want to take one more question?
Yeah, sure.
John?
Yeah.
Okay, let's take one more question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Hindal Ansari. I'm a fellow at the Gulf International Forum. So in light of the current events happening in Gaza right now, I was wondering if you could talk to us about how you see American efforts in, democratization initiatives and all that deterring when it comes to like considering Biden's unconditional support for Israel, because this kind of echoes the time around Iraq War and post-Iraq War, where there was a rise in anti-American sentiments among the Arabs and the Arab populace. So can you tell us how things might be looking like moving forward, given the light of events happening right now?
Yeah, so on the first point, Radwan, I mean, you're making my book's argument quite well, and I'm less familiar with some of the tensions around gay rights in Tunisia. I've heard things here and there. I think there should be more work done on exactly how much pressure was put around these issues, but certainly I've been hearing about various US funded and EU funded programs that do try to bring this to bear. And there's this quote, from Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, where someone asked him about LGBTQ rights in conversations with his Arab counterparts. And I think it was about Saudi Arabia specifically. And Blinken said something, maybe it was a pro forma response, but he said something, we always make sure to bring up LGBTQ rights with our Saudi counterparts, which is absurd for a lot of reasons. But not to say that, again, we don't have to like any of this. So we can like and wish that there was more gay rights in XYZ country, but it's not about what we want. That's the point I really want to make clear. And in Afghanistan too, I think that there was really an effort to transform really fundamental understandings around gender in a society that was just extremely conservative around some of these issues. And I think you see some of those similar tensions, and the Taliban used that to its advantage in a number of ways. I'm glad we can just touch on Gaza and Palestine, at least in passing towards the end, because I guess it's on a lot of our minds. Okay, so I'm very much in favor that if there is a post-Gaza vision, which I would hope there can be at some point, and I would hope that the US can get serious about that, elections should be held within a reasonable time frame for the Palestinian Authority. I argued in a recent Washington Post column that there has to be a path for low and mid-level Hamas cadres to be reincorporated in the democratic process. There would have to be some demobilization and some commitments around, not resorting to, violence and so forth. But I think there has to be an answer for you can eliminate the senior military leadership of Hamas, but if there's tens of thousands of members and hundreds of thousands of supporters and sympathizers, this idea that you can eliminate Hamas is, I think, a pipe dream. And the longer we sort of engage in this fantasy, the more off track we'll get when this war ends. So I think we have to be thinking very seriously about what that might look like. Because if you hold elections and you say, well, XYZ parties can't participate, then you have more of a legitimacy problem. And you already have a legitimacy problem with anything relating to the PA. So you want to limit that. You want to find ways to maybe inject more legitimacy into the process. And then on the last question, it's a really good one. I actually I have a column coming out tomorrow in the Post where I talk about Arab American disaffection with Biden. I was just home in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania for Thanksgiving, and I had a bunch of conversations with Arab friends and a couple relatives. And basically, they mostly said, there were 4 of them that I engaged in conversation with around these issues. All 4, it's a small sample size, but there is polling that's done that makes clear this is not just my 4 friends and family members. They said, we're not going to vote for Biden. We'll see, we'll see. But I'm hearing this across the Arab and Muslim American community, and it's a big issue. And I think I'm kind of torn myself because I've generally been a kind of a forthright proponent of American power. And I've argued that it's better to live in a world where there is American hegemony than a world where there is not American hegemony, because the alternative, whether it's China, Russia, and so forth, would be worse. As flawed as we are better than the alternative, because at least we have the pretense to morality. And I'm actually I'm actually supposed to be writing a new book, and I'm on contract with the publisher. The title that we agreed on, which I now have to change because I just don't feel comfortable saying this outright anymore. The title, forgive me for this, is On Power, the Case for American Dominance. And I'm almost done writing it, but now I'm gonna have to recast a bunch of it because I'm in a crisis now. As an Arab American, as a Muslim American, I'm losing faith in the idea of American power in real time. So I'm dealing with this right now as someone who's worked on these issues for a long time. I just don't know how I can go to other Arabs, whether it's here in America or in the region, and say, America is a force for good on balance. How can I say that to them now? It just seems such a silly argument to be making while the bombardment of Gaza is happening. So we'll see what happens in the months to come. But I am sort of facing this crisis. But I think a lot of Arab Americans are contending with these questions now.
Well, great discussion. Unfortunately, we have to end it. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Please pick up Shadi's book. He's going to sign his books. And thank you, Shadi and Tom. Great.
Thanks so much.
It was great to talk to you.